This edition of the Nutgraf, published on 1st March 2025, is titled Jiohotstar is not content. India's mightiest streaming giant should be very happy with where it finds itself, but it's not. It wants more. Here's a great job interview question for a strategy role that I often use. You can take note, it's quite useful, and feel free to steal it. First is the setup, and here's how it goes. You are India's biggest OTT app. You've just acquired the second biggest OTT app last year, which makes you India's largest streaming platform by users. By the way, you also have exclusive rights to telecast the country's biggest sporting events, the Indian Premier League, which is played out over 2 whole months. As a bonus, as a conglomerate, you effectively own India's largest telecom company, the largest successful IPL cricket team, and India's largest retailer. Then I ask this question. So, what should be your growth strategy? At this point, I usually wait for about 5 seconds. If the candidate answers with anything other than the words nothing, I reject them immediately. Now, you're also ready to hire for that strategy role. Exactly a year ago, when it was confirmed that Jio would acquire Disney Plus Hotstar's India business, in this newsletter, I published an edition titled, and I quote, "It's Jio's world now. We are just watching it," end quote. Back then, I wrote, there isn't a single media company anywhere in the world which comes close to this level of market dominance on the OTT side, so this will be both interesting and terrifying to watch. Essentially, I wrote about the implications of one company having this kind of power and dominance in streaming, from having the ability to segment the market better than anyone and to having an extraordinary amount of power over its advertisers. And all of this was before Jio decided to combine Jio Cinema and Hotstar to create one big streaming super app. You'd think that after so much winning, JioStar would relax a bit. It's practically India's default streaming app with access to India's default sporting event. JioStar doesn't need a strategy anymore. JioStar is the consequence of a successful strategy. Well, as we are finding out, JioStar isn't content. All of this is still not enough. And that's because JioStar has discovered that it is no longer competing with another streaming app or another cricket team or another telecom network. It's gone past all of that. JioStar is now competing with the most hardened adversary that all mighty companies eventually come up against: consumer behavior. Consumer behavior is the most difficult competitor for any company. It can be very annoying because changing it takes time. You can play all your moves perfectly, but consumers are unpredictable, annoying, and simply do not do what you expect them to do at the level that you want them to. And so, JioStar has been spending an inordinate amount of time coming up with ways to counter it. As an instance, here's the news from last week. I quote from a story titled, "India's Reliance touts brain mapping to lure IPL advertisers after Disney merger." This is a story that was reported by Reuters. And I quote, "After striking an $8.5 billion media merger with Walt Disney, Indian billionaire Mukesh Ambani is targeting small businesses and promoting unconventional neuroscience studies to boost its revenues from the IPL, the world's most valuable cricket league. The pricey broadcast rights for the Indian Premier League and other cricketing events, which cost Disney and Reliance nearly $10 billion in recent years, are set to weigh big on the merged group, which is India's biggest entertainment giant. The document shows Reliance is privately pitching advertising agencies with brain mapping research that it says analyze the brain cells or neurons of participants to show its streaming ads have a higher engagement rate than Google." End quote. Look, I'm not a scientist and I've not seen Reliance's presentation, so I have no idea if this brain mapping thing is true. Also, I'm wondering if Reliance segmented the brain mapping responses by which IPL team did these participants support and what that reveals about them. I have my theories, but I also live in Bengaluru, so it's not safe for me to expound on this. Anyway, The telling aspect of this is not whether Reliance's brain mapping research is accurate, but the fact that it had to do stuff like this in the first place to woo advertisers at all. In another universe, I can imagine Jio's big pitch to advertisers as a one slide presentation with the words, "We have IPL" in big 72-point font size. The end. Why say anything else at all? Of course, one reason why Reliance has to say more is because advertisers are not convinced that saying that is good enough. As the Reuters story notes, this is partly because Reliance raised advertising rates this year by up to 25%. It's one thing to be more expensive, but advertising is a two sided market. You can raise prices all you want, but unless there's demand that's willing to pay that price at the density that you desire, it's practically pointless. In many ways, price discovery is automatic in advertising that happens at scale. Even if you're Reliance, you can't do much to change that. However, I'm assuming that one of the reasons why Reliance is doing all of this fancy brain mapping stuff is because enough advertisers aren't convinced about the returns that they're getting from advertising in the IPL. This is what makes apparent the real battle that Jiohotstar is fighting, not against advertisers, but against consumer behavior. Put another way, why don't Instagram and YouTube have to sell brain mapping stuff to their advertisers? The simple answer is because advertisers there have a better way of knowing and can measure exactly what they get in return for the ads that they put there. And for all advertisers, that metric is quite simply some form of direct response. Instagram or YouTube are great for direct response or performance advertising, where the user sees an ad and responds to it by buying something or downloading an app or filling a form. And that's not because Instagram or YouTube has better tech or better strategy compared to Jiohotstar, but because those platforms encourage that specific consumer behavior. Jiohotstar telecasts a sporting event which people watch continuously. They'll probably be okay watching ads in between, but will be less likely to interrupt their game to go and check out and buy that D2C brand. Jiohotstar is spending a lot of time, effort, and money to convince its advertisers that the money that they spend to do brand advertising on Jiohotstar gives actual returns. Measuring brand advertising ROI has always been a conjectural exercise. But if Jiohotstar can offer some research that makes them believe that it's working, well, why not? This is just one example of consumer behavior that Jiohotstar is battling. Another one that it's up against is the content itself. Again, this is somewhat perplexing. You'd think that a platform that houses the IPL, all of cricket content, HBO, Star TV, Disney, Marvel, and much more local content would be content with its offering. Well, no. Jiohotstar is now adding more content and it's doing it by attracting YouTubers. Just look at the list of YouTubers that they have coaxed and got onto their platform to create reality shows. A couple of weeks back, I wrote about how YouTube is trying to become new television by getting YouTubers to do television like shows. Well, Jiohotstar is also trying to do exactly the same thing. Both of them are approaching the same consumer preference from separate directions. It's one thing to get YouTube creators on board, but it is another thing to replicate everything else that YouTube offers content creators. Think about all of these features: memberships, super chats, subscriptions, advertising revenue, shorts. These are YouTube's biggest weapons, honed, crafted, and tested in the unforgiving fires of consumer behavior. I imagine that Jiohotstar's biggest test in the next few weeks when the IPL begins isn't whether it can get the viewers, it already has them. It's not about whether it can get the advertisers either, it already has them. Jiohotstar's biggest test is whether it can get its users and consumers to behave differently and in ways that make Jiohotstar into the default platform for creators, advertisers, and content. And until this day comes, Jiohotstar will always need to have a strategy. This edition of the Nutgraf has been read by Praveen Gopal Krishnan, and you can find the full edition on the Ken's website at theken.com/thenutgraph. Credit also to Rajiv CN for the sound and the production for this episode. I'll see you again with another edition of the Nutgraph next week.